Welcome. Today, our guest is Mike Mears. Welcome to Mike. Mike has over 40 years of leadership experience, and he's the author of best-selling book Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovation. It embraces neuroscience, psychology, and leadership. And Mike, you have worked with Jack Welch, and you've also studied over 8,000 bosses. So we're going to be taking a look into that. Welcome, Mike. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Rebecca and Cal, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. In fact, I'll lead off with a quick Jack Welch story, which will make more sense once we get into the leadership journey I've been on. But this is an apocryphal story at GE. I was there for about 9 years. He had a dinner that he was hosting for his union chief who was retiring. And of course, the union management had some pretty significant brush-ups during that period of time. But anyway, it went very cordial, good meeting. And at the end, the union chief stood up and he said how much he loved GE. He loved the people. The employees were the best in the world. And then right at the end, he paused and he looked at Jack Welch and he said, and you know, Mr. Welch, for 34 years, you've had use of my hands. And if only you had asked, you could have had my brain. Isn't that an interesting story? And so years later, when I was starting to get into the neuroscience of things, leadership is a lot about just connecting with and getting the best out of all those human brains. I think Welch learned a lesson during that dinner because he did use something he called workout, which is like a quick win. And he used Six Sigma, which really gets at people's heads, lets them participate.
Mike, thanks for sharing this story and welcome to the podcast. It's awesome to have you here. Maybe a good place to lead on from that conversation is in your book where you mentioned you studied 8,000 bosses and you sort of built out these traits of these leaders. One of the things you talk about is the primitive brain. I wonder if you could just kind of tell us a little bit more about that and what that means in the context of leadership.
Well, Cal, if I ask the listeners now, what is basic human instinct? I think everybody would pause for a second, and then somebody would say survival, and then pretty much everybody would agree. About 95% would agree, and that's what the psychologists tell us. When you think about that survival mechanism, we're no longer scared of bears going to and from work, but that's just physical fear. But we have a whole host of social fears and social drives that are extremely important to us as people. Again, they're unconscious. So that raises all kinds of interesting issues when you have a boss. Deep down, what I found is you're unconsciously a little bit fearful of looking silly in front of your boss, and that drives a lot of behavior, which is why we need to give and get feedback effectively and so forth. So it's just an interesting, quick model that you just say, what is human nature? How do we best get the best out of human nature? What works and what doesn't? And what you quickly learn is the state that we're generally in is status quo. We tend to cling to the status quo because it's certain, right? Back to that book title. And the brain abhors uncertainty because of the survival instinct. So what really great leaders do is they'll give you a sense of certainty that you're doing a good job, you fit in around here. They get all those cobwebs out of people's heads. And then that's why they're able to implement change, because change is uncertain, always. And so leadership is all about getting people to change in a positive way. So that concept of being certain or not certain is absolutely crucial in how well organizations perform.
Definitely, and I've experienced that firsthand myself. And you talk in your book around building that environment of certainty where you mention, promoting trust, overcoming fear, building communication. What do you think is the best way that leaders can start to implement a culture of those areas in their team or their business?
Well, back to that 8,000 boss study I did, it was roughly several thousand employees in the intelligence community, American intelligence community. And what I did is very simple. I said, write down all the bosses you've ever had in your organization and then rate them from great, good, neutral, poor, awful. And then I collected that. So it's a report on 8,000 bosses. But it's absolutely fascinating because then the next question is, okay, what is it about the bad ones, which we can go into if you want? But more importantly, what is it about the good ones? What do they do in answer to your question about behaviors and trust building and all that? So at first, it was very hard to get somebody to give you a descriptor that could easily be copied. People say, well, he had integrity. Well, we all think we have integrity. It's a cognitive bias. So that's not helpful. So what we finally had to do is get them 200 people who had a really good best boss, they said, tell us stories. So we took all these stories and then we broke them apart to find out what are the behaviors of best bosses. And then that gets you back to your question, which is, okay, what about, what do you do? What's psychological safety? How do you build trust? We took those broad categories and we could clump the behaviors in each. So first and foremost, we found psychological safety. If you don't feel safe with somebody, you're not going to trust them. So psychological safety was first, and the behaviors are so simple. It's smile at somebody in the morning, for goodness sake. Say hello to people. This is not difficult. Show concern when appropriate. Show empathy when appropriate. And then the next category, after you have psychological safety, then you can get to your question about trust. And you just fall back on the old law of reciprocity and consistency to build trust. And it's what kind of gifts do you give people periodically? And for some, it's information. For some, it's knowledge. For some, it's assistance. For some, it's praise. It's little gifts that you continuously give, and you build that sense of trust with that employee. And then once you've built trust, finally, you can get to the good communication side, really have clarity on expectations and all that rich stuff. So it was a fun exercise to go through, and it kind of helps put together all these leadership elements, how they fit in.
Definitely. And when you were going through that study, Mike, were there any traits or qualities that came out of that study that you were a little bit surprised by, or you didn't expect to necessarily be there in terms of what good leadership looked like?
No, I did this way back in '99. So the first thing that shocked me was safety. This concept of safety, because there's a woman at Harvard, Amy Edmondson, who's kind of the guru on psychological safety. So at the time I was doing that study, she did her first study as a budding psychologist on psychological safety. Well, today it's pretty much widely accepted in a lot of big organizations that this really is crucial. But that was early on. So the safety aspect shocked me. Second thing is, I'm an old lone wolf spy that, used to go out extended periods and do things. And you're carefully selected for different jobs at CIA. It's ranging from psychological assessments to psychiatric exams to the polygraph and numerous interviews and so forth. So they're pretty sure getting the right square peg in the square hole. So they did with me. Well, what that means is I am lower in empathy than you two are in general. And so when we were doing the study, I discovered that the really great boss has two real interesting aspects where they have huge drive to work really through people to get better performance, number one. And number two, it's balanced with empathy. And the reason is because if you didn't have the empathy and you had the drive, you'd be an autocratic boss. So it makes sense, doesn't it? Think about your boss probably was one of these, quote, I'm tough but fair people. But so the empathy did surprise me. And then since then, numerous studies have come out to show that's part of leadership, concern for others.
Oh, I definitely agree with you on that, Mike. I think that's so true. I think being an empathetic person is such a key trait to being an effective leader. But I wanted to circle back to the start of your career when you kind of worked in the military and the CIA. How does that leadership style, I'm sure you had a range of leadership styles you were exposed to there, but what was that in general? What was the leadership style like there compared to your time in, let's say, the more sort of corporate world?
Wow. Three things flash in my head, Cal. One of them was at West Point. I went to West Point before going in the Army. And way, way back then, the philosophy, believe it or not, was survival of the fittest. If you can take a lot of harassment, physical abuse, psychological abuse, and you get through it, you're going to be a good leader. Well, that's ridiculous. But that was for ages, that was the philosophy. And then that got completely revamped in the 1990s until today. It's what I think the three of us would agree is, makes up a great leader: concern for other people and inspiring them and pulling out things they didn't even know they could do. So that was number one. Number two was there was a study done at West Point where they found that combat leadership, for example, is different than regular leadership in this one way. And that is, if my boss in my workplace at at my organization, let's say, I don't really care. I don't rank his competency in the technical side of the business as high as you would think. I look more toward his people skills and his ability to really ignite me. But in combat, what happens is that suddenly that competency becomes number one of the leadership skills. And the reason is, well, it's obvious. If your leader is not totally competent in everything involving weapons and tactics and so on, your life's going to be at risk. And they found the same thing. This is interesting. Found the same thing with other careers that are sort of like that, like firemen, that could be life or death. You really want your boss to be very competent in carrying out those, or even taking parachute lessons. Gee, I sure hope this person teaching us how to jump out of an airplane knows how to pack a chute. So that was, to me, was interesting. And then the final thing is, but I don't want to push down the importance of the human side. And I'll give you a real quick story on that. I always made my men fill sandbags every night so that if there's a rocket attack or mortar attack in Vietnam, that they would be protected. Well, nobody likes filling sandbags. So we're driving out to a beach in a truck, and I've got a headache. I could see the mud smeared on the windshield, and the sun is just slicing across the South China Sea to where we're going to this beach. I just didn't feel good. And so I'm thinking, this is a no-win leadership moment. I got to tell these guys to fill sandbags. Half are going to complain because they've got to work in the hot sun. And then the other half are going to complain because they got to lie down on guard duty, basically, to make sure we're secure. And they're going to be complaining about the sand fleas and so on. I thought, this is just so typical of leadership. And the truck stops. And Spec Johnson, listed man, jumps off the back. He's coming around the side of the truck. And I said, "Hey, Johnson, what do we do here?" And he looked at me and said, "Oh, that's easy, sir. You split them into 3 groups." A little surprised. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "On the first group, put them on perimeter duty and make sure you get 2 guys up on that sandhill over there because there's a military crest on that and you can't see both sides." So I'm starting to get impressed with Spec Johnson. And then he said, "In the second group, sir, fill sandbags." And then he paused and he said, "And the third group goes swimming." And I thought, I never thought of that. I never thought of that. And then he looked at me and he said, "And then, sir, we rotate." So everybody that day on that beach in Vietnam got to swim. We all had fun. We got the mission done, filling the sandbags, and we were safe and secure. And, thank you, Spec Johnson. But that's one of those human sides of leadership, what taught me to start listening to other people, because what's in their head, just like Jack Welch, what's in their head is probably a lot better than what's in your head. And just by inviting him to participate, I'm sure I made his day. Didn't mean to go off on that, but that triggered an old story.
It's a great story, and it's a great illustration of how leadership should be today. And when you did that assessment of 8,000 bosses back in Mike, what difference do you think you would see today in 2025?
What's happened is I also started up the Leadership Academy there. And so we have trained every frontline manager in sound leadership principles as we know them today. And so what's happened is the bullying and abusive behaviors in a small fraction of leaders has disappeared. I think we've kind of ground that out culturally. But you've had a couple of episodes recently on people talking about attributes. And boy, that rang my bell, because we live in an age where we say, when I grew up, leaders were born, not made. That was what we thought. And then starting in the 70s, 80s, the pendulum started swinging to leaders are made and not born, or everybody can be a leader. And the truth is somewhere in between. There are certain people that have phenomenal native leadership attributes, like Colin Powell, if you remember him. Heck, I would put Zelensky there and others. So the one thing we could do better is selecting leaders with more validity, instead of just picking people for technical skills to be, say, the best salesperson now is now the sales manager. Well, that might work, but what are the people skills of that person? So when we tend to keep picking people based on technical skills, we don't improve the quality of that management group. And that's a problem because there's certain people you just can't train and develop good leadership behaviors into. If you ever had a worst boss, my worst boss, Fred, was was a diehard autocrat. Another category on the worst boss category were the micromanagers. You've seen those. Another category was the kind of best buddy boss. Think The Office, the TV show. They drive us crazy. And then a third category is the autocratic micromanager, which is really problematic, right? But anyway, you can psychological assessments and behavioral interview techniques, and even OJT can screen out most of those people and really make a big difference inside of an organization because you're starting with a good boss to begin with.
So you mentioned the sound leadership skills, techniques, attributes. What do you think those are? Let's actually nail those, Mike. What do you think the top 3 are?
What I'll do, let me go back to what science has told us. Believe it or not, do you know who, and you would never know this, who invented leadership assessments? Well, today you see them done by the Gallup organization, and they're done by Talent Plus. All these organizations can assess somebody and pick out. Believe it or not, that was discovered by the OSS, which was CIA's predecessor, in 1943, and the Brits were working on it at the same time, and so were the Germans, because if you could assess people and predict future behaviors, not perfectly, but if I'm an optimist today, I'm probably going to be an optimist 2 or 3 years from now. So the Americans cracked that and ran their first OSS class through in August of 1943. Anyway, that was top secret at the time, but it escaped in the world in 1948. And so you get a lot of these assessment companies have done highly valid work in this area. So I'll just give you a few. So first and foremost is that drive we talked about, because if you don't have a passion, how are you going to pull other people with you? Secondly, the empathy. Balancing that makes you a good person because I'm driving forward, but I'm looking out for your interests. Third one is optimism. I mean, think about that. I tell Cal, this is not going to work. This situation's terrible. We're going to fail. Follow me. Come on. All great leaders are real optimists. And another funny one that pops in there, they're learners. They're curious and they're learners. Isn't that interesting? So, and you can actually assess all those.
So it doesn't surprise me that curiosity is in there, particularly in the fact that asking questions, I think one of the things I learned as a leader was you don't have to have all the answers. And as you said in your story, when you ask others for their opinion, they have better ideas than you might have yourself. So a leader must elicit and encourage other people to speak, to feel safe to speak up, to come up and share their ideas. But Mike,
I love that. I'm going to steal that from you, Rebecca, which is a leader doesn't have to know all the answers. They just have to know the questions, right?
But Mike, you must have faced some challenging leadership experiences in your career. You cannot have spanned 40 years of leadership without having some of those. So could you share a story with us or an experience with us that would resonate with our audience about a challenging leadership experience, how you coped with that, and the lessons you learned from it that would inspire others?
When I look back on my very long life, Rebecca, I think, when was I in a leadership position in which I had huge stress on me? And I'm not just talking about external stress. I'm talking about internal stress too of, I'm just not firing on all cylinders in this job. What's wrong? And what I discovered as I started reflecting on that is, again, looking at the empathy side, low in empathy, maybe not as actively listening to other people as I should about their concerns and whatnot. And I discovered that anytime I had a general hard go of it, it was when I didn't have a deputy or a second in command who perfectly complimented me. And I can remember one time I had a woman named Cindy that worked for me. We ran this huge top secret compartmented program, and she was just my eyes and ears on everything and picked up stuff I couldn't believe. And in one case, saved a man's life simply because she had built up so much psychological safety with one of our employees that the employee came to her and confessed she had made a mistake on encrypting something. And it was just a simple mistake. It really wouldn't matter normally, but Cindy and I both knew additional information about that agent. Because we realized, oh my God, this is something went in the clear and could actually result in this guy's death. We were able to fix it immediately. But the only reason was Cindy had so much empathetic behavior and listened to employees, built psychological safety with everybody, that they would come. So you actually had a unit in which all that feedback continuously came up, so you didn't get blindsided. So that was my big lesson: is have somebody that compliments you, know your strengths and weaknesses, and then go for somebody that's that's got the opposite set and can really help you out.
You've mentioned empathy a few times now and psychological safety and the importance of it. What would be 3 practical tips that a leader today could do to create psychological safety and demonstrate empathy? You have mentioned a couple of them, but
I've got some good ones for you. My whole thing is simply saying, okay, you're locked in status quo. What happens? How do you give people certainty in their mind? Well, think about the modern office. There's a Gallup survey that says this is the Q12, they call it. But one of the questions is, my boss has given me positive feedback in the last week, or you see other ones, last 2 weeks or month. We still are where we were 20 years ago.
no.
With less than 25% of the people getting positive feedback. How could that be? That's the easiest thing in management to do. It takes 5 seconds to give somebody positive feedback. And so I'm working, not working with Gallup, but I'm looking over their shoulder, because I've really got an interest in what happens to the human brain when you get a validation, a piece of positive feedback, right? There's something they call social pain they study in a lot of neurolabs. So when I tell that employee, hey, you did a good job on that PowerPoint you presented yesterday, it appears that half-life of that compliment lasts about a week, so that for a week that employee has certainty in their brain over all these little angsty questions in their unconscious about, is the boss mad at me? Do my colleagues respect me? Am I doing a good job here? Is there a bigger purpose to this? Am I linked into something above? Just with that little compliment. And so if I had my career to live over again, I would 8-fold increase my positive feedback. And in many cases, bosses don't do it, because if you think about it, bosses don't know 95% of what you do during the week, because they're not in your office the whole time. Well, that's easy. You just ask the employee, what are you proudest of doing this week? How hard is that? Whatever they tell you, give them an attagirl or attaboy. Say, thank you. I'm proud of you for doing that, or I'm happy you did that, or that really helped the company. So that would be number one. Number two is something that Jack Welch stumbled into, called check-ins. He didn't name that, but what he did during his reign was, we had these awful 1-year blackout periods where you had no idea what you were doing, and then 1 year you get your review. And the stakes were high because he always cut out the bottom, 8-10% or so. So it was a terrible period of uncertainty. And then, so he realized that, and he cut that out. Actually, and GE had invented that system in the early 1900s, but he cut it out, and then had bosses check in frequently to tell you where you are and have casual conversations and so on. And I lived through that, and what a difference it made in my psychological outlook. Today, you got companies like Adobe and others adopting check-ins, and all they are very brief 5-minute session or less with each employee a week. Keep it informal. You could check in one question, how they're doing, or what they're having problems with, or how can I help you, or that, what are you proudest of doing this week? But something is giving feedback back and forth, just having that casual conversation, and that's crucial. So I gave you two. Those are two so simple, they're hard to believe. And then in my book, I've got one called an insight prompt, which really goes deep into some recent discoveries in the brain's insight mechanism and how you can trigger that with employees. So I would use that one too, without going into too much detail. But anything you can do to provide certainty is really the way to go in leadership.
I don't think I can leave it without you telling us just a little bit more before we wrap up about what you mean by insights. So to summarize so far, we've got the check-ins, a compliment. I'm going to add a third C to that. It's about having conversations. So what's the insights? What's
I caught you, didn't I? So what that is two neuroscientists in the around 2008, 9 started debating on what is insight, and psychologists thought it's just quick. It's a quick aha moment in the prefrontal cortex, and they said, well, that doesn't make sense. What triggers it? What is it? And so they were both experts in different kinds of scanning equipment. And so they did a series of operations in their lab, spurring insights into subjects. And this is so bizarre. It's like it sounds like magic. But first off, it's just a tiny area above your right ear that literally explodes instantaneously. That's the insight. So it's like the cartoon thing with the bulb going off when you have an insight. Secondly, to have it, you have to be in a pretty much relaxed state, alpha wave state. For no apparent reason, the frequency goes up, and that's when the explosion occurs. And then when the explosion occurs, it immediately wires new neurons. So it's about as bizarre a brain function as you can imagine. And then one day I asked John Cunhos, who's one of the co-discoverers, I think he'll get a Nobel Prize for this. I asked him, I said, well, what about the chemicals? Have you looked at brain chemicals when you have an aha moment? And he said, that's the amazing thing. He said, there's, maybe 30 some chemicals sloshing around in our brain. But one thing that happens is you get a jolt of dopamine, and that feels good. So when you're doing your Sudoku or your crossword puzzle, and you have that even a little aha, it feels good. And that's why we love solving puzzles. Or you could have a huge aha of this is the person I'm going to marry or whatever, life-changing ahas. But then he said, and then some of the other brain chemicals combine and they give you a complete sense of certainty. So there's that word again. So you're certain that you're going to marry that person, or you're certain you're going to write that answer down on the crossword puzzle because of that wash of chemicals. So I immediately thought, well, how do you use this in the workplace? And I'll give you two quick CI stories, I promise. One of them is I'm walking along the 7th floor of CIA with a director, CIA, and I won't name him. He turns to me, he says, Mike, why is it they're not being more creative? And I knew what he was talking about was the employees, because he wanted to see more creativity. And then he paused and he said, I've told them in my first 5 talks, I want more innovation. So how do you answer that? It's sort of a naive question, but it's also extremely important question is you can't tell people. So how do you get them to be more creative? Okay. So the second CI director was a fellow named Leon Panetta. And you remember the hunt for bin Laden, right? Mm-hmm. It took a long time because he was absolutely off the grid, no technical traces. So Panetta would have a 5 o'clock every Wednesday bin Laden session, and you'd go in there and they'd chat about what they had done, and then finally get down to, okay, what are new ideas to catch him. He looked over at one case officer, one director of operations officer, and he said, so what new ideas have you got? And the hapless fellow said, Chief, I don't know. I'm just out of ideas, and we're all out of ideas. And Panetta flared up for a second, and then he did what a good leader would do. He relaxed and he said, excuse me, I was angry, not at you, but at the moment. So he said, let's do this. Let's adjourn the meeting and everybody break, and you go back and think about how to catch bin Laden and bring back 10 ideas next session. Everybody broke, meeting went. So what do you think happened at the next meeting? A week later, they have 37 new ideas to catch bin Laden. And what he did, that's an insight prompt, he inadvertently gave mental homework to somebody. They're safe because they can think about it. They can do it while they reflect, driving to and from work, in the shower, jogging, whatever way they can reflect. And they're coming up with new ideas. The certainty chemicals are taking hold, so they're absolutely bought into it. And it's a really powerful concept that a boss can use to really get people to do anything from changing and improving culture, which is one of the hardest things executives do. Simply give it to the employees. Let them think about it. Let them figure. Now, the trick is you got to have the accountability at the end of it, which which the director had because they're coming back talking to CIA directors. Surely you're going to think. I've used this at the U.S. State Department, and we got some wonderful results where we would have people take a month and think about ways to radically improve the workplace or the work. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have a large session in which you report back to the boss and the boss's boss your new ideas and concepts. And that's all it took. You got to have a little accountability to drive. So I didn't mean to go off in that much detail, but there's some fantastic ways if you just start thinking about human nature that we can use to lead and manage better and make people happier and do it in a more humane way.
Well, thank you, Mike. You've shared plenty of tips here. I particularly like that one about insights and empowering the team to take hold of the problem and come up with ways in their own time to think about it without the pressure of that moment. Because sometimes when we're in the pressure of that moment, we can't think.
Exactly.
Yeah. So giving them the time to do that. Mike, it's been a real pleasure to hear your experiences, for you to share them with us today. What would be the best way for listeners and viewers to get in touch with you?
Well, I'm at the give back stage of life, so I'm not selling anything. I'm just giving out, things that I've learned. So please do contact me. I love hearing from people, and probably LinkedIn is the best way. And or if not, my email is Mears, MEARSHM @gmail.com. So absolutely love to hear from folks and hear the stories and so forth.
Continue to be curious, Mike.
Absolutely. And you too.
Thank you very much indeed,
Thank you,
Mike.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.